Marcus Thompson wiped the sweat from his brow as he adjusted his police radio, the static crackling through the humid Atlanta morning air while he patrolled the downtown district that had been unusually quiet for a Tuesday. The veteran officer had seen his share of strange incidents during his 15 years on the force, but nothing could have prepared him for the emergency dispatch that suddenly burst through his radio speaker, the dispatcher's voice trembling with barely controlled panic as she reported multiple incidents of violent attacks across the city, with victims described as exhibiting erratic behavior and unresponsive to commands. Meanwhile, across town at Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Emily Rodriguez was completing her night shift in the emergency room when the first wave of bite victims began arriving, their wounds unlike anything she had encountered in her medical career, deep puncture marks that seemed to fester and darken even as she worked to clean and dress them. The patients themselves were equally disturbing, their eyes glazed and unfocused, their skin taking on an alarming grayish pallor that spread from the bite sites like some kind of infection, and despite her attempts to communicate with them, they remained unresponsive except for occasional groans and aggressive movements that required restraints. Jake Mitchell, a construction worker who had been installing new security systems in the government buildings downtown, noticed the commotion from his scaffolding position 20 stories up, watching as crowds of people began running through the streets below, their screams barely audible over the distance but their terror unmistakable as they fled from something that remained hidden from his elevated vantage point. The radio chatter from his work crew's walkie-talkies became increasingly frantic as reports came in from various job sites around the city, describing workers being attacked by what appeared to be rabid individuals who moved with jerky, unnatural gaits and seemed impervious to pain or reasoning. At the local news station, investigative reporter Amanda Foster had been tracking a series of mysterious deaths that occurred near a pharmaceutical research facility on the outskirts of the city, deaths that had been officially attributed to a rare viral infection, but her sources within the medical examiner's office had whispered about unusual brain activity in the deceased and strange preservation of motor functions long after clinical death should have occurred. When the emergency broadcasts began interrupting regular programming, Amanda realized that her investigation had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than corporate negligence or environmental contamination, something that was now spreading through the population with terrifying speed and efficiency. The first confirmed transformation occurred in the hospital where Dr. Rodriguez was working, when one of the bite victims she had been treating suddenly convulsed on the examination table, his back arching impossibly as his vital signs flatlined on the monitors, only to have him open his eyes moments later with a milky white film covering the pupils and an unnatural hunger that became apparent when he lunged at the nearest nurse with newfound strength and coordination. Marcus Thompson received the hospital's frantic radio call just as he was investigating reports of similar incidents at a downtown shopping center, where security cameras had captured footage of ordinary shoppers suddenly turning violent and attacking other customers with an almost primal ferocity, their movements becoming increasingly coordinated as if driven by some collective instinct. Jake Mitchell watched in horror from his construction perch as the chaos spread through the city streets like wildfire, emergency vehicles racing in every direction while crowds of panicked civilians fled from areas where the infected seemed to be gathering in growing numbers, their shambling forms moving with surprising purpose through the urban landscape. The military response came swiftly but seemed woefully unprepared for an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with or intimidated, as traditional crowd control methods proved useless against adversaries who felt no pain and showed no fear, their only apparent motivation being an insatiable drive to spread their condition to others through violent contact. As the afternoon wore on, the four strangers found themselves drawn toward the city's emergency shelter that had been hastily established in the convention center, each carrying their own expertise and survival instincts that would prove crucial in the days ahead, though none of them yet understood the true scope of the catastrophe that was unfolding or the role they would play in humanity's fight for survival against an enemy that had once been their friends, family, and neighbors. The emergency shelter at the downtown convention center had transformed into a maze of frightened humanity, with hundreds of survivors huddled in makeshift family groups while National Guard soldiers attempted to maintain order amid the growing chaos that seemed to seep through the building's walls like a toxic fog. Marcus Thompson arrived first among the four, his police uniform granting him immediate access past the security checkpoints, though he quickly realized that his badge carried little authority in a situation where traditional law enforcement protocols had become meaningless against an enemy that couldn't be arrested or deterred. The veteran officer moved through the crowded space, observing how quickly civilization's veneer was beginning to crack under pressure, as arguments broke out over food distribution and sleeping arrangements while children cried for parents who might never return home. Dr. Emily Rodriguez entered the shelter shortly after, her medical credentials immediately putting her to work in the hastily assembled triage area where she found herself treating not only fresh bite victims but also injuries sustained during the panicked evacuation, though she noticed with growing alarm that several patients she had bandaged earlier were beginning to exhibit the same grayish pallor and glassy-eyed stare that had preceded the transformation at the hospital. Jake Mitchell managed to talk his way past security by claiming he was part of the construction crew that had worked on the convention center's recent renovations, his knowledge of the building's layout and structural weak points proving valuable to the military personnel who were struggling to fortify a facility never designed to withstand a siege. Amanda Foster arrived last, her press credentials and persistent questioning initially earning her suspicious looks from the authorities until she began sharing intelligence about the pharmaceutical facility and the mysterious research that might have triggered the outbreak, information that suddenly made her an invaluable asset to the overwhelmed command structure. As evening approached, the shelter's population had swollen to nearly 2,000 people, straining resources and patience while reports continued filtering in about the situation deteriorating throughout the city, with entire neighborhoods going dark as communication networks failed and emergency services became overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the crisis. The first sign of serious trouble came when the perimeter guards reported increasing pressure from infected individuals who seemed drawn to the shelter's location, their numbers growing throughout the night as they gathered in the surrounding streets with an almost magnetic attraction to the concentration of uninfected humans. Marcus found himself working alongside the military personnel, his street experience proving valuable in identifying potential security breaches and weak points in their defensive perimeter, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy that grew stronger with every person they lost. Dr. Rodriguez discovered the horrifying reality that the infection could remain dormant for hours before manifesting, when a woman she had treated for a minor scratch suddenly convulsed and transformed in the middle of the medical area, attacking a volunteer before being subdued by security forces who were forced to use lethal force to stop the threat. The incident sent shockwaves through the shelter population, triggering panic and demands for mandatory quarantine of anyone who had been exposed, creating a dangerous divide between those who showed symptoms and those who remained uninfected, with families being torn apart by fear and suspicion. Jake's knowledge of the building proved crucial when he identified several maintenance tunnels and service corridors that hadn't been secured, potentially offering entry points for infected individuals who might bypass the main security checkpoints, prompting a frantic effort to seal these vulnerabilities before they could be exploited. Amanda worked frantically to establish communication with other survivor groups and emergency centers, using her media contacts and broadcasting equipment to coordinate information sharing while documenting the unfolding crisis for any future survivors who might need to understand how the outbreak had spread and evolved. The night brought the first coordinated assault on the shelter, as hundreds of infected individuals began pressing against the barricades with a persistence that suggested some form of collective intelligence or shared purpose, their movements becoming more organized and strategic as they tested different approaches to breaching the defenses. The four strangers found themselves naturally gravitating toward each other, their diverse skills and backgrounds creating an informal leadership group that others began looking to for guidance and direction when the official authorities seemed overwhelmed by the unprecedented nature of the threat they were facing. As dawn approached, the harsh reality became clear that the shelter was not the safe haven they had hoped for, but rather a temporary refuge that would soon become untenable unless they could find a more permanent solution to the growing infected population that surrounded them like a living siege engine, driven by an insatiable hunger that would not be denied indefinitely. The dawn light revealed the true horror of their situation as hundreds of infected bodies pressed against the convention center's reinforced glass walls, their lifeless eyes reflecting the morning sun while their hands clawed relentlessly at any surface that might yield entry to the human feast waiting inside. Marcus Thompson stood at the main security checkpoint, watching the military personnel struggle with ammunition shortages and the psychological toll of repeatedly firing into crowds that had once been ordinary citizens, their faces still recognizable beneath the gray pallor and mindless hunger that now defined their existence. The veteran officer realized that conventional crowd control tactics were not only useless but potentially counterproductive, as the infected seemed to learn from each failed assault, adapting their approach and finding new pressure points in the shelter's defenses with an intelligence that defied their apparently mindless state. Dr. Rodriguez had established a makeshift laboratory in one of the convention center's back rooms, working desperately to understand the infection's progression by studying blood samples from recently turned victims. Her medical training revealing disturbing patterns in how the pathogen seemed to preserve motor functions while destroying higher brain functions in a selective manner that suggested engineered rather than natural evolution. Her research was interrupted by increasingly frequent medical emergencies as more shelter occupants began showing early symptoms of infection, creating a growing quarantine section that strained their limited resources while generating fear and resentment among the uninfected population who demanded more aggressive isolation measures. Jake Mitchell had become the unofficial chief of security engineering, using his construction expertise to reinforce weak points in the building structure while identifying potential escape routes that might allow organized evacuation if the main defenses failed, though he understood that any movement outside the shelter would expose them to the thousands of infected individuals who had gathered in the surrounding blocks. His work crew background had taught him to think systematically about complex problems, and he began developing contingency plans for different scenarios, from temporary relocation to permanent fortification, though each option seemed increasingly unrealistic as their situation deteriorated. Amanda Foster maintained communication with other survivor groups through jury-rigged radio equipment, discovering that their situation was not unique, as reports came in from across the country describing similar outbreaks and failed containment efforts, painting a picture of a nationwide catastrophe that far exceeded their initial estimates of the crisis's scope. Her journalistic instincts drove her to document everything, interviewing survivors and recording their experiences while gathering intelligence about safe zones, supply caches, and potential allies who might offer assistance or coordination opportunities for any future survival efforts. The breaking point came during the second night when a section of the infected crowd managed to breach one of the loading dock barriers, pouring into the building's lower level in a coordinated assault that caught the defenders off guard and resulted in multiple casualties before military personnel could establish a new defensive line deeper inside the structure. The sound of gunfire echoing through the convention center's halls created panic among the civilian population, with families grabbing whatever possessions they could carry while pushing toward the main exits, creating dangerous bottlenecks that threatened to turn evacuation into a deadly stampede. Marcus found himself coordinating between military leadership and civilian groups, his police experience in crisis management helping to maintain some semblance of order while tough decisions were made about who could be evacuated first and what supplies were essential enough to risk lives retrieving. Dr. Rodriguez made the heartbreaking discovery that several people in their quarantine section had turned during the chaos, forcing her to help implement emergency containment protocols that separated infected individuals from their families, often permanently, while she continued working on understanding how the pathogen spread and whether any form of immunity or treatment might be possible. Jake's structural assessment revealed that the building's compromised sections were spreading the damage throughout the foundation, making their current position untenable within hours rather than days, forcing the leadership group to accept that evacuation was no longer optional but an immediate necessity for survival. Amanda's radio contacts provided crucial intelligence about a potential safe zone at a military installation 50 miles outside the city, though reaching it would require traveling through heavily infected territory with limited transportation and no guarantee that the facility remained operational or welcoming to civilian refugees. The four had evolved from strangers into an informal command structure, their complementary skills creating a leadership dynamic that others naturally followed, though they each understood the crushing responsibility of making decisions that would determine who lived and died among the 2,000 people looking to them for guidance. As they finalized evacuation plans during the pre-dawn hours, reports came in that the infected were beginning to organize into larger groups, suggesting either evolutionary adaptation or some form of communication that allowed coordination beyond their individual hunting instincts, a development that fundamentally changed the nature of the threat they were facing. The final preparations for evacuation required brutal choices about supplies versus speed, vulnerable individuals versus group survival, and immediate safety versus long-term sustainability, decisions that would haunt the survivors regardless of their ultimate success or failure in escaping the convention center before it became their tomb. The evacuation began before dawn with a convoy of hastily assembled vehicles ranging from military trucks to civilian cars, their headlights cutting through the darkness as 2,000 desperate survivors prepared to leave the only sanctuary they had known since the outbreak began, each person carrying whatever possessions they could manage while knowing that many of them would not survive the 50-mile journey to the rumored military safe zone. Marcus Thompson rode in the lead vehicle with the convoy commander, studying maps and radio reports that painted a grim picture of the route ahead, with multiple roadblocks created by abandoned vehicles, collapsed bridges, and confirmed infected concentrations that would require careful navigation and potentially costly detours to avoid direct confrontation. The veteran officer had helped organize the evacuation into 3 waves, with the most vulnerable civilians in the center convoy protected by military vehicles front and rear, while scout teams moved ahead to identify threats and clear obstacles that might trap the entire group in hostile territory where retreat would be impossible. Dr. Rodriguez traveled in one of the medical vehicles, treating injured evacuees while monitoring those showing early infection symptoms, her makeshift laboratory equipment providing real-time analysis of the pathogen's progression and confirming her worst fears that the infection was mutating rapidly, becoming more virulent and possibly developing airborne transmission capabilities that would make containment virtually impossible. Her research had revealed that the infected retained more cognitive function than initially believed, explaining their increasingly coordinated behavior and suggesting that they might be capable of learning from their encounters with human survivors, adapting their hunting strategies and communication methods to become more effective predators. Jake Mitchell drove one of the supply trucks, his construction background making him valuable for clearing road obstacles and assessing structural damage to bridges and overpasses that the convoy needed to cross, though he worried constantly about the vehicle's mechanical reliability and fuel consumption rates that would determine whether they could reach their destination before running out of essential resources. His practical experience with heavy machinery and logistics had made him the unofficial quartermaster for the evacuation, responsible for ensuring that their limited supplies of food, water, ammunition, and medical equipment were distributed efficiently while maintaining reserves for emergency situations that would inevitably arise during their perilous journey. Amanda Foster rode with the communications team, maintaining contact with other survivor groups and monitoring emergency broadcasts for intelligence about changing conditions along their route, her media background proving invaluable for interpreting conflicting reports and identifying reliable information sources among the chaos of military transmissions, civilian radio chatter, and what appeared to be deliberate misinformation designed to lure survivors into traps. The first major obstacle appeared within hours of departure when the lead scouts reported a massive pileup on the interstate involving dozens of vehicles and what appeared to be hundreds of infected individuals who had been feeding on trapped motorists, creating a choke point that would force the convoy to take surface roads through suburban areas where visibility was limited and ambush opportunities were numerous. Marcus coordinated with the military leadership to divide the convoy into smaller, more maneuverable groups that could take parallel routes through residential neighborhoods, though this strategy increased their vulnerability to coordinated attacks while reducing their collective firepower and mutual support capabilities that had proven essential during the convention center siege. The decision to split up proved prescient when Amanda's radio intercepts revealed that infected groups were actively tracking the convoy's movement, somehow communicating position information and coordinating blocking maneuvers that suggested a level of strategic thinking that fundamentally challenged their understanding of what they were fighting against in this new reality. Dr. Rodriguez made a disturbing discovery when examining recently infected individuals who had been captured during skirmishes along the route, finding evidence of rapid evolutionary changes that seemed to be occurring within individual subjects rather than across generations, implying that the pathogen was actively rewriting genetic code in real time to optimize survival and transmission characteristics. The middle section of their journey took them through a series of small towns that had been completely overrun, their populations either evacuated or transformed, leaving behind empty streets lined with abandoned businesses and homes that created an eerie landscape where any structure might contain hidden threats or valuable supplies depending on the courage and necessity of the searchers. Jake's mechanical skills became crucial when several vehicles broke down simultaneously, requiring rapid field repairs under combat conditions while infected individuals emerged from hiding places to investigate the noise and activity, forcing the convoy to establish defensive perimeters while essential maintenance work continued under extreme pressure and time constraints. The most harrowing encounter occurred when they discovered that a group of infected had learned to use vehicles themselves, driving in erratic but purposeful patterns to herd the convoy toward prepared ambush sites where larger concentrations of their kind waited with what appeared to be deliberate tactical positioning rather than random congregating around noise sources. Amanda's documentation of these encounters provided crucial intelligence about the evolving nature of their enemy, revealing that the infection was not simply creating mindless zombies but rather transforming humans into something that retained enough intelligence to learn, adapt, and coordinate while losing the moral and ethical constraints that defined human civilization. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, fuel shortages and mechanical failures began taking a serious toll on their mobility, forcing difficult decisions about which vehicles to abandon and which supplies to prioritize, while radio contact with their destination revealed that the military installation was under siege and might not be able to provide the sanctuary they had risked everything to reach. The military installation appeared on the horizon like a beacon of hope, its concrete walls and guard towers silhouetted against the afternoon sky, but Marcus Thompson's experienced eye immediately noticed troubling details through his binoculars that suggested their destination might not provide the sanctuary they had desperately sought during their harrowing 50-mile journey through infected territory. The perimeter lighting was dark, no movement was visible in the guard towers, and most ominously, the main gates stood wide open in violation of every military security protocol he had ever encountered, creating an invitation that felt more like a trap than a welcome for exhausted survivors who had lost nearly half their convoy during the treacherous road march. Dr. Rodriguez monitored the radio frequencies that should have been buzzing with military communications but found only static punctuated by occasional distress calls from other survivor groups, her medical training telling her that something catastrophic had occurred at the installation that made their planned refuge potentially more dangerous than the open road they were attempting to escape. Her analysis of infected tissue samples during the journey had revealed accelerating mutations that seemed to be creating specialized variants, some optimized for speed and agility while others developed enhanced strength and durability, suggesting that the pathogen was rapidly adapting to create different classes of infected individuals suited for specific hunting and combat roles. Jake Mitchell's engineering assessment of the installation's defensive structures revealed signs of recent combat damage, with blast marks on the walls and damaged vehicle barriers that indicated the facility had been overrun from within rather than conquered by external assault, implying that the infection had somehow penetrated their security measures and transformed the military personnel into the very threat they had been fighting against. His construction expertise allowed him to identify structural weaknesses that could be exploited for either entry or escape, though he worried that whatever had overwhelmed a fully equipped military garrison would make short work of their depleted civilian convoy that had already exhausted most of their ammunition and medical supplies during the journey. Amanda Foster's media contacts had gone silent one by one throughout their trip, but her final communication with a news helicopter pilot revealed disturbing footage of major cities completely overrun, with infected populations organizing into massive hordes that moved with apparent coordination toward remaining population centers, suggesting that their local crisis was part of a nationwide collapse that had effectively ended organized resistance to the outbreak. Her documentation efforts had captured evidence of infected individuals using tools and weapons, operating vehicles, and even setting traps for survivors, behavior that challenged every assumption about their cognitive abilities and implied that humanity was no longer fighting a plague but rather an evolutionary competitor for planetary dominance. The convoy's approach to the installation triggered an immediate response from hidden infected forces that had apparently been using the facility as a base of operations, their attack demonstrating tactical coordination and strategic thinking that included flanking maneuvers, diversionary assaults, and what appeared to be deliberate attempts to capture rather than kill certain convoy members for unknown purposes. Marcus found himself commanding desperate defensive actions while coordinating a fighting withdrawal that required abandoning most of their remaining vehicles and supplies, his police training in crisis management proving inadequate for military-scale combat against an enemy that felt no pain and showed no fear while demonstrating increasing sophistication in their assault tactics. The infected forces included former military personnel who retained enough muscle memory to operate complex equipment, creating the nightmarish scenario of facing their own weapons and vehicles in the hands of adversaries who combined human intelligence with inhuman persistence and coordination, forcing the survivors to adapt their strategies in real time while under continuous assault from multiple directions. Dr. Rodriguez made a horrifying discovery when examining captured infected soldiers, finding evidence that the pathogen was preserving and even enhancing certain specialized skills while eliminating emotional and ethical constraints, creating super soldiers who retained their training and knowledge but served only the imperative to spread the infection and eliminate human resistance through any means necessary. Jake's knowledge of military installations allowed him to identify a forgotten maintenance complex on the facility's periphery that might provide temporary shelter while they regrouped and planned their next move, though he understood that their options were rapidly dwindling as fuel, ammunition, and hope were consumed by their increasingly desperate situation. The revelation that nowhere was truly safe fundamentally changed their survival strategy from seeking sanctuary to accepting perpetual movement, constantly staying ahead of the infected hordes while searching for other survivor groups that might offer mutual support and resource sharing in a world where traditional civilization had effectively ceased to exist. Amanda's radio equipment picked up scattered transmissions from international sources suggesting that the outbreak had spread globally, with reports of similar incidents in Europe, Asia, and other continents, painting a picture of worldwide catastrophe that meant rescue or reinforcement from outside sources was impossible and survival would depend entirely on their own resources and ingenuity. The four leaders faced the crushing realization that their group of remaining survivors represented not just a refugee convoy but potentially one of the last intact human communities in their region, carrying the responsibility of preserving knowledge, skills, and human values in a world increasingly dominated by their transformed former species. As night fell around their temporary shelter, they began planning for a future that would require abandoning all hopes of returning to their previous lives while developing new strategies for long-term survival in a hostile environment where every day would bring new challenges and the constant threat of discovery by infected forces that seemed to grow stronger and more organized with each passing hour. The maintenance complex provided only the illusion of safety as Marcus Thompson established guard rotations among their remaining 37 survivors, his police instincts telling him that their temporary refuge would soon be discovered by the infected patrols that seemed to methodically search every structure in the area with an efficiency that suggested they were following some form of systematic protocol rather than wandering randomly in search of prey. The veteran officer had noticed disturbing patterns in the infected behavior during their retreat from the main installation, including what appeared to be deliberate herding tactics designed to drive survivors toward specific locations where larger concentrations of infected waited in ambush positions that required advanced planning and coordination capabilities far beyond what they had initially attributed to the transformed humans. Dr. Rodriguez worked feverishly in her improvised laboratory space, analyzing blood samples and tissue specimens that revealed the pathogen was not only mutating rapidly but seemed to be sharing genetic information between infected individuals through some form of biological networking that allowed successful adaptations to spread throughout the infected population within hours rather than the generations typically required for evolutionary change. Her medical background had prepared her for many horrors, but nothing could have equipped her to understand the implications of her discovery that the infection was creating a collective intelligence that retained human knowledge while eliminating human compassion, resulting in a species that combined the worst aspects of human cunning with predatory efficiency and an apparent immunity to the psychological warfare that had been humanity's greatest advantage throughout history. Jake Mitchell's engineering assessment of their current position revealed multiple structural vulnerabilities that would make defense impossible if the infected located their hiding place, forcing him to develop contingency plans for rapid evacuation through a network of utility tunnels that connected to the broader municipal infrastructure, though he worried that these same passages might already be compromised or actively monitored by infected scouts who had demonstrated increasing sophistication in their surveillance and tracking capabilities. His practical experience with urban construction had taught him to think in terms of interconnected systems, and he began developing a long-term strategy that involved constant movement through industrial and commercial areas where infrastructure knowledge could provide tactical advantages against enemies who might retain military training but lacked his specialized understanding of how modern cities were built and maintained. Amanda Foster's communication efforts had revealed the existence of other survivor groups scattered across the region, though establishing secure contact proved increasingly difficult as the infected seemed capable of monitoring radio transmissions and using that intelligence to locate and eliminate human communities with surgical precision that suggested they had retained enough technical knowledge to operate sophisticated surveillance equipment while developing new hunting strategies optimized for urban warfare. Her journalistic training in source verification had become crucial for distinguishing legitimate survivor groups from infected traps that used captured radio equipment to lure desperate refugees into carefully prepared ambush sites, a tactic that implied the infected were not only learning from their encounters with humans but actively developing psychological warfare techniques designed to exploit hope and desperation. The group's first major decision involved whether to remain hidden and hope for rescue that might never come, or to actively seek out other survivors while risking exposure to infected forces that seemed to grow stronger and more organized with each passing day, a choice that would determine not only their immediate survival but their long-term viability as a human community in a world increasingly dominated by their transformed former species. Marcus advocated for a mobile strategy that would keep them ahead of infected search patterns while allowing them to gather intelligence about safe zones and resource caches that might still exist in less populated areas, though he understood that constant movement would expose them to greater risks while preventing them from establishing the defensive positions and supply stockpiles that traditional survival doctrine would recommend. Dr. Rodriguez's research had identified several potential weaknesses in the infected physiology that might be exploited for defensive purposes, including sensitivity to certain chemical compounds and apparent difficulty operating in extreme temperatures, though developing practical applications would require resources and laboratory facilities that were no longer available in their post-civilization reality. Her medical knowledge also revealed that several survivors were showing early signs of psychological breakdown under the constant stress and horror of their situation, requiring immediate attention to maintain group cohesion and prevent the kind of internal conflicts that could destroy their community from within even if they successfully avoided external threats. Jake's infrastructure expertise proved invaluable when he identified a series of interconnected facilities that could provide temporary shelter while they developed more permanent solutions, including water treatment plants, power substations, and industrial complexes that offered both defensive advantages and essential resources for long-term survival, though accessing these locations would require careful reconnaissance and coordinated operations that exposed them to significant risks. Amanda's intelligence gathering had revealed disturbing reports about infected behavior in other regions, including apparent attempts at agriculture and construction that suggested they were not simply predators but were actively building some form of post-human civilization that incorporated the best aspects of human knowledge while eliminating the ethical and moral constraints that had defined human society throughout history. The survivors faced the psychological challenge of accepting that they were no longer members of the dominant species on Earth but rather refugees from an evolutionary transition that had transformed their friends, family, and neighbors into something that was simultaneously familiar and alien, requiring fundamental changes in how they thought about identity, community, and survival in a world where traditional human values might be evolutionary disadvantages. As they prepared to abandon their temporary shelter and begin the next phase of their survival journey, each member of the group understood that they were not simply trying to outlast a temporary crisis but were adapting to permanent changes that would define the rest of their lives and the future of any human communities that managed to survive the ongoing transformation of their species and their world. The abandoned steel mill on the outskirts of the industrial district offered both strategic advantages and terrible risks as Marcus Thompson led the convoy of survivors through its rusted gates, the facility's maze of catwalks and furnace chambers providing multiple defensive positions while its isolated location reduced the likelihood of accidental discovery by the organized infected patrols that had been systematically sweeping through more populated areas with military precision. The veteran officer had chosen this location based on Jake Mitchell's assessment that the complex infrastructure would allow them to monitor approaches from multiple directions while offering numerous escape routes through the facility's connection to the regional rail network, though he worried constantly about their dwindling ammunition supplies and the psychological toll that constant vigilance was taking on survivors who had already endured more trauma than most humans could reasonably be expected to process. Dr. Rodriguez established her mobile laboratory in one of the mill's former administrative buildings, her research revealing increasingly disturbing evidence that the infected were not only retaining more human knowledge than previously believed but were actively experimenting with their own biology, apparently testing different mutations and adaptations in controlled environments that suggested a level of scientific methodology that challenged every assumption about their cognitive capabilities and long-term objectives. Her analysis of intercepted infected communications, conducted through crude but effective bioelectric signals that she had learned to detect and partially decode, revealed that they were sharing information about human survivors, defensive positions, and tactical innovations with a speed and efficiency that made traditional military intelligence gathering seem primitive by comparison. Jake Mitchell's engineering expertise proved crucial as he fortified their new position while developing innovative early warning systems using the mill's existing infrastructure, including motion sensors connected to the facility's crane systems and acoustic monitors that could detect the distinctive movement patterns of infected groups, though his most important contribution was identifying several emergency exits that connected to underground maintenance tunnels leading to other industrial facilities throughout the region. His practical experience with heavy machinery allowed him to restore power to critical sections of the mill using the facility's backup generators, providing lighting and communication capabilities that dramatically improved their defensive readiness while offering the psychological comfort of electric power in a world that seemed to be rapidly returning to pre-industrial conditions despite the advanced biological intelligence of their infected adversaries. Amanda Foster's intelligence gathering had revealed the existence of a substantial survivor community located in a fortified mining complex approximately 200 miles to the north, though establishing contact required penetrating infected-controlled territory where their enemies had apparently learned to jam radio communications while using captured broadcasting equipment to spread false information designed to lure survivor groups into carefully prepared ambush sites that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology and desperation. Her journalistic background had taught her to verify sources and cross-reference information, skills that proved invaluable when she discovered that several supposed survivor broadcasts were actually infected traps that used recordings of human voices to create convincing distress calls and false reports of safe zones, a tactic that implied their enemies had not only retained human intelligence but were actively studying human behavior to develop more effective hunting strategies. The group's most significant discovery came when they captured an infected individual who retained enough human speech to communicate basic concepts, revealing that the transformed humans were not mindless zombies but rather members of a new species that considered themselves superior to their uninfected ancestors, viewing the outbreak not as a plague but as an evolutionary leap that had liberated them from what they described as the weakness and inefficiency of human emotion and morality. Marcus found himself conducting what amounted to an interrogation of a prisoner who was simultaneously human and alien, familiar and utterly foreign, whose responses revealed that the infected maintained detailed knowledge of human survivor groups while viewing them as obstacles to be eliminated rather than fellow beings deserving of compassion or mercy, a perspective that fundamentally challenged his law enforcement training in dealing with human criminals who at least shared basic moral frameworks. Dr. Rodriguez's examination of their prisoner provided crucial insights into the infection's progression, confirming that the transformation preserved technical knowledge and problem-solving abilities while eliminating empathy, fear, and other emotions that the infected apparently viewed as evolutionary disadvantages, creating beings that combined human intelligence with predatory efficiency and an apparently limitless capacity for violence in service of their collective survival objectives. The prisoner's revelations about infected society revealed a disturbing picture of post-human civilization that included agriculture, manufacturing, and even primitive research facilities where they were apparently working to optimize their biological advantages while developing new weapons and tactics specifically designed to overcome human defensive strategies, suggesting that the conflict between species would only intensify as both sides adapted to their new reality. Jake's analysis of the information provided by their prisoner led him to conclude that their current fortifications, however impressive, would provide only temporary protection against enemies who were learning and adapting faster than human defenders could develop countermeasures, forcing them to accept that long-term survival would require abandoning defensive strategies in favor of constant movement and the kind of guerrilla warfare that favored mobility over firepower. Amanda's documentation of the prisoner interviews created a record that she hoped might someday help other survivor groups understand what they were fighting against, though she understood that the information also painted a grim picture of humanity's prospects in a world where their former species had evolved beyond recognition while retaining enough human knowledge to exploit every weakness in traditional defensive thinking and survival strategy. As winter approached and their supplies continued to dwindle, the four leaders faced the ultimate decision about whether to attempt the dangerous journey to the distant survivor community or to remain in their current position and hope that spring would bring new opportunities for resistance against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger and more organized with each passing season. The decision to abandon their fortified position came during a frigid February morning when Amanda Foster's radio intercepts revealed that infected forces were converging on their location from multiple directions, apparently having decoded enough of their communication patterns to anticipate their defensive strategies while coordinating a massive assault that would involve thousands of transformed humans equipped with captured military hardware and an intimate knowledge of the steel mills. Layout gained through systematic reconnaissance over the preceding weeks. Marcus Thompson gathered the remaining 23 survivors in the facility's main conference room, his police experience in crisis leadership helping him present their desperate situation with calm authority while outlining the brutal reality that staying meant certain death while attempting the 200-mile journey to the northern mining complex offered only slightly better odds of survival against organized enemies who controlled most of the territory between their current position and their intended destination. Dr. Rodriguez had completed her analysis of the infection's latest mutations, discovering that the winter months had triggered adaptations that made the infected more resilient to cold weather while enhancing their ability to coordinate complex operations across vast distances, effectively eliminating the seasonal advantages that human survivors had hoped might provide temporary respite from the relentless pressure of their transformed adversaries who seemed to view the extermination of uninfected humans as both a biological imperative and a strategic necessity. Jake Mitchell's final engineering assessment of their situation confirmed that the steel mill's defenses would be overwhelmed within hours of a coordinated assault, making immediate evacuation their only viable option despite the enormous risks involved in moving a group of civilians through hostile territory controlled by enemies who had demonstrated increasing sophistication in their hunting techniques and tactical coordination while developing specialized units apparently designed for different aspects of anti-human warfare. The evacuation began under cover of darkness, with survivors carrying only essential supplies while following escape routes that Jake had carefully planned to avoid known infected strongholds and surveillance positions, though everyone understood that their enemies' apparent ability to share information instantaneously meant that discovery was inevitable and survival would depend on speed, determination, and the kind of desperate courage that emerges only when faced with absolute extinction. Amanda Foster maintained radio contact with the northern survivor community throughout their flight, receiving increasingly urgent updates about infected forces massing near the mining complex in apparent preparation for a coordinated assault that suggested their enemies had identified all remaining human strongholds and were systematically eliminating them in a campaign that demonstrated strategic thinking and resource allocation capabilities that rival traditional military planning while incorporating biological advantages that made conventional defensive strategies obsolete. The first major confrontation occurred at dawn when their group encountered an infected patrol that had apparently been positioned to intercept exactly the escape route they were using, forcing Marcus to coordinate desperate defensive actions while the survivors fought running battles through abandoned industrial complexes where every shadow might conceal enemies who combined human intelligence with inhuman persistence and coordination that made retreat as dangerous as direct confrontation. Dr. Rodriguez treated wounded survivors while continuing her research under combat conditions, her medical expertise proving crucial for keeping the group mobile despite injuries and exhaustion that would normally require extended rest and recovery, though she understood that stopping for any significant period would allow their pursuers to organize blocking forces that would trap them in territory where human survival was measured in hours rather than days or weeks. Jake's knowledge of industrial infrastructure provided crucial advantages as he guided the group through utility tunnels, abandoned rail lines, and forgotten maintenance corridors that connected major facilities throughout the region, though their enemies' apparent retention of technical knowledge meant that these same routes might be compromised or actively monitored by infected forces who understood urban systems as well as any human engineer or city planner. The final approach to the mining complex revealed the full scope of their new reality as massive infected armies surrounded the facility in siege formations that demonstrated military discipline and tactical sophistication, their coordinated movements and apparent communication systems creating a battlefield scenario that resembled conventional warfare between organized species rather than the chaotic outbreak they had initially experienced during those first desperate days in the convention center that now seemed like memories from another lifetime. Amanda's final broadcasts documented their arrival at the mining complex's outer perimeter, where they discovered that the survivor community had evolved into a sophisticated resistance organization with advanced weapons, fortified positions, and most importantly, a strategy for long-term survival that involved constant mobility, guerrilla warfare, and the preservation of human knowledge and values in a world where their species was no longer dominant but could still fight for the right to exist alongside their transformed former relatives. Marcus found himself appointed to the Resistance Leadership Council, his law enforcement background proving valuable for coordinating civilian protection while military specialists handled direct combat operations against infected forces that had organized themselves into something resembling a post-human civilization with its own goals, strategies, and apparently inexhaustible determination to eliminate the last remnants of uninfected humanity from a planet they now considered their evolutionary inheritance. Dr. Rodriguez joined a network of survivor scientists working to understand the infection's continued evolution while developing countermeasures that might level the playing field between species, her research contributing to humanity's growing understanding that they were not fighting a plague but rather engaging in the first interspecies war in human history against an enemy that had once been themselves. Jake's engineering expertise became crucial for the Resistance's mobile infrastructure, helping to design portable facilities and transportation systems that could support a nomadic human civilization that would survive through constant movement and adaptation rather than the fixed settlements and territorial control that had defined human society throughout history. Amanda's documentation efforts evolved into a comprehensive archive of human survival strategies and infected capabilities, creating a knowledge base that might help future generations understand how their species had adapted to share the planet with their transformed evolutionary successors, while her communication skills proved vital for coordinating between scattered survivor communities that represented humanity's distributed response to existential transformation. As spring arrived and the war between species intensified, the four survivors who had first met during those desperate hours in the Atlanta Convention Center understood that they had become founders of a new form of human civilization, one defined not by dominance over their environment but by resilience, adaptation, and the determination to preserve human values and knowledge in a world where survival itself had become humanity's greatest victory against impossible odds.